name a show that you enjoy watching. Grey's Anatomy. Boo. No, I'm just kidding. All right, what else? I heard The Bachelor. Is that? All right. I'm a big The Blacklist fan. Anyone else ever watch The Blacklist? Well, if you haven't, totally recommend it. It's a great show. I'm also a huge fan of The Office. That's my personal favorite show. Glad we got some other Office fans in here. Not Parks and Rec, The Office. But The Blacklist is probably my favorite, and I think it's my favorite because of the action and like how intense it is every episode. And I find it so funny that every single episode, I know the ending pretty much. Like pretty much every action movie or action show you've ever watched, you know the ending to. The good guy comes out on top, he gets the girl, he saves the day. That's pretty much what happens every single time. And in The Blacklist, I know at the end of every episode, Reddington and Liz, the two main characters, are gonna be fine. But every episode, they almost like get killed off of the show. But like I'm so nervous and on the edge of my seat the entire time, and I find that funny though. Like I know the end of the story, but every single time I'm still sitting there nervous and worried and stressed out the whole time I'm watching it. But like that's how we live our lives though. Like God's already told us how our story ends, right? Like he's told us the end of the story, but yet we're still worried and nervous, and we can't hardly do anything in this life without worrying about what we're in right now and our circumstances right now. And Revelation actually talks about this. Revelation talks about how at the end of time, God still reigns. Because God is eternal and God still reigns at the end of time. So we've got to shift our perspective, and that's what we're going to be talking about this morning, is shifting our perspective, because too often we have our perspective as the here and now rather than eternity. So this morning we're going to be talking about shifting our perspective from now to eternity. Before we actually jump into the message, I want to pray, but before I pray, I want to ask you all to do something, if that's okay. There are two things I want to ask. One, I want to ask you to pray specifically for you and for God to open up your mind this morning, for him to open up your heart this morning to receive whatever message he wants you to receive. And then the second thing I want you to pray for is specifically pray for me and pray that God uses me as a mouthpiece. Rather than me telling you what I want to tell you, pray that God uses me to tell you what you need to hear. So I'm going to pray for that, and I ask that you would pray for those two things. God, thank you for this morning for all that you do for us. Thank you for this past week and just being faithful to us. And this morning I just pray for all of us that our minds and our hearts are open to receive whatever you have for us this morning. I also want to ask that you speak through me, that what I want to say goes away and only what you say comes out. I know that there's someone here this morning who needs to hear this message, and I just pray that you allow them to receive. In Jesus' name. So like I was saying, we are going to be talking about perspective, and if we're honest, probably all of us have lost perspective at some point. Whether it be in our jobs that causes the stress and the worry that we focus on that, or our families, or our spouse causes lots of stress and anxiety, or our kids, our finances, our family, but something in this life is constantly causing problems for us. Constantly, over and over and over again, and it causes us to focus in on that. I'm reading a book right now called The Storytelling Animal, and in The Storytelling Animal, it's about how the storytelling forces our minds to pay attention. I don't know if you know this, but when someone tells a story, your brain automatically pays attention whether you're telling it to or not. No matter what, when someone starts a story, your brain's paying attention. This morning, right now, I am telling you how this works, and I'm telling you, if I started a story right now, by the middle of the story, you would forget that I am telling you that I'm trying to trick your mind. Like you would forget in the middle of the story. That's just how our brains work, because that's their default position, is to focus in on story. And every single one of us are living life, and our lives, your life is a story. Can we agree that life is a story? That what you're living through now is a story, because your past is a story and your future is going to be a story. And just like if I stand up here and tell a story, your brain focuses on it, it's the same way in your life right now. Your mind and your brain is so focused on what you're going through and what you're doing that you've forgotten about an eternity that exists. Anyone willing to admit that their perspective has shifted this morning? Anybody? Show of hands. I'm willing. My perspective has shifted away from eternity, and my perspective has shifted to where I am now and the problems that I'm facing now. like I was telling you, story does this to us, right? Like when we're watching TV, has anyone ever watched TV and someone walks in front of it and you don't even realize it? Like you look around the room, there's like 3 people sitting in there and you started the TV show like by yourself. Because like that's happened to me before. I'm sitting there and I just, suddenly something captures my attention outside of what I'm watching and the story that I'm following. It's like, oh, there's other people in the room with me. Or someone's talking to me and like I don't even realize that they're talking to me because I'm so focused. Because that's what it does. It makes us focus. Our lives do the exact same thing to us because we're living a story. So our minds are focused on the present story rather than realizing that we know the end. So why should we try to shift our perspective? Like, why should we? Like, why is it important to shift our perspective? Well, when you keep your perspective on eternity and the end of your story, it makes pushing through your present problems easy. How many of you have problems in your life? I hope everyone's hands are up right now because I know everyone in this room has problems. We all go through things in our life. But when we know that there's an eternity on the other side of everything that we're going through, it makes our current problem much easier to deal with, right? If you know that in the end, this short life that you're living now is going to come to an end and you're going to be able to step into the presence of God, how much easier is it to deal with your current situation? Because we've been talking about how this series is called Uncomfortable, right? And this is our the last week of this series. And we're talking about being uncomfortable. And this life is uncomfortable. Like God never promised for his people to be comfortable. We are uncomfortable, and it's going to be uncomfortable. But because it's uncomfortable now, we are getting prepared for the future. And we're moving towards God's presence, closer and closer and closer. When I was working on this, I got really convicted over this myself, just because I realized how far away from this perspective I was. And I wrote this down: exist in anticipation for the end to persist through your present problem. Exist in anticipation for the end to persist through your present problem. Eternity makes this life a whole lot easier. There's an analogy, and there's a speaker that I love. His name is Francis Chan. Some of you may know who Francis Chan is. I wish I would have come up with this analogy on my own, but no, I didn't. It's a Francis Chan analogy. I'm a huge Francis Chan fan. But he has a rope on stage, and he's holding one end of the rope, and the rest of the rope wraps all the way around the room. So if you will, this morning, imagine I'm holding one end of a rope, and the rest of the rope is wrapping around the gym. And he's holding one end, and on the end that he's holding, there's a piece of tape, and it's about this much of the rope is covered with tape. And he said, I want you all to look at this, and you can't see the end of the rope. And he says, I want you all to look at this rope. He said, this little part right here that has tape on it represents our life here. Like, it's hard for us to understand eternity. It's actually impossible for us to understand eternity because everything on earth has a beginning and everything on earth has an end. But eternity is timeless, meaning it didn't have a beginning and it doesn't have an end. So we cannot comprehend eternity. But think with me, our life in comparison to eternity is so, so small. For me, numbers help me to understand things a little bit. So when I'm thinking about this, I like to think a little bit in numbers. So if we give everyone an average, some live longer, some live shorter, but if we gave everyone an average of 80 years, let's say you have 80 years. And we're going to say that that's like $80, okay? If you have $80 and someone said, hey, if you'll give me that $80, I'll give you billions. Would you take that? Like, would you take that if someone says, hey, I will literally hand you billions and billions if you'll give me 80? Who doesn't take that? But like, that's what God does for us with eternity. Eternity is never ending, billions and billions and billions. If you even want to try to put a number on it, it's never ending. But yet we have 80 years here, and some of us are like, you know what? This 80 years is mine. Like, I got to live my life for this. We've got to shift our perspective from the here and now to eternity, because it makes everything with our relationship with God that much more important. We're not the only people who have lost perspective. We're not the only ones. And in the Bible, there's a guy named Peter. And Peter was one of the disciples of Jesus. And Peter lost perspective. And this morning, I want to tell you a quick story about Peter and whenever Jesus was being arrested. And right before they went to the garden and they were having their last supper together, Jesus looks at his disciples and said, all of you are going to fall tonight. All of you are going to fall tonight. And Peter says, no, I'm not. He said, Jesus, like, I will not fall. Like, if I have to die, I won't fall. It's really funny that he's saying this to Jesus, like Jesus created him in his mother's womb, as if Jesus doesn't actually know. He's like, not Jesus, you don't know me. Like, no, like I'm stronger than that. Like, I will die with you. And Jesus says, no, Peter, you won't. You're going to fall. And later that night, they're in the garden. And the guards come, and they come to arrest Jesus. And Peter, being the hard-headed person he is, obviously he's like telling God he doesn't know what he's talking about. Being the hard-headed person he is, Jesus tells them that the guards are going to come and that they're going to arrest him. And when they get there, Peter draws his sword and he chops off someone's ear. Okay? Chops off someone's ear. More than likely, I'm thinking, in my head at least, there's no way this was like one of the big Roman guards. Like, he probably went for the smallest one he could find. Like, he was like, yeah, I got to act like I'm big and bad, so I'm going to go for the small guy. At least I'm doing something. And he chops off his ear. Like, all right. But Jesus walks over and he picks up the man's ear and he heals the man's ear. And then Jesus is taken away. And Peter and John follow him. Whenever they took Jesus away, it says that the disciples scattered. And I think it's important and crucial to understand that the disciples scattered. Okay? They scattered, meaning they were alone. And that's when Peter denied Jesus. That's when Peter fell. Was when he was alone. Last night I called one of my friends and I was asking him some questions and just getting his perspective on what I'm talking about this morning. I wanted to see if he had anything else that he could add to. He's a really smart guy. I was like, hey, do you have anything else you want to throw in here that I could say in the morning that would be really good? And I started reviewing what I was talking about, and he said, well, see, I just talked, a few weeks ago, and something that I talked about I think would fit perfect. And it was just one phrase, and it says that isolation breeds destruction. Isolation breeds destruction because we aren't meant to be alone. We aren't meant to be by ourselves. Like, this life was meant to spend in community with other people. Earlier I said that our brain's default position is to focus on the here and now, right? I said that the default position, and the default position is where something always goes to if there's not a force behind it moving it in another direction, right? And so if we don't have a community of people behind us and a force behind us trying to say, hey, your perspective is changing. Let's hold on. I'm reminding you, shift your perspective back to eternity. If there's not something there doing that, then your brain's always going to go back to the default position, which is the focus on the here and now. We were meant to live in community. And just like the disciples, they walked with Jesus. So you would think that people who walked with Jesus would be able to do pretty much anything. I mean, their faith would be strong enough to withstand being alone. But not even the disciples could withstand being alone. So why do we think that we can? We have life groups and we have the church, right? Like we meet on Sunday mornings. Right now, in 2018, is the easiest time that there's ever been to not be in church. Like, you can go online and listen to sermons that are better than me, Frank, or Richard could ever preach. And you can go online and listen to worship that's better than any of us could ever play. But you can't get the community that comes with it. Because there is something about community that we have to have. Because if we actually want to grow and desire to grow in our relationship with God, we have to exist with other people and in a community with other people. Even the disciples couldn't do life alone. Yeah, you could read the Bible on your own, or you can listen to Scripture, or you can listen to a message and you can listen to worship on your own, but you're not growing in your relationship with God because nothing's pushing you forward. There's not an external force pushing you forward because your brain's always going back to the default position of the here and now rather than eternity. Later on in that story of Peter, he goes back to fishing. And I think, again, it's really important that we catch that because sometimes we read over things in the Bible, but they were in there because we have to understand what's going on. So it says that Peter went back to fishing because Jesus, whenever he found Peter, he was a fisherman. And he called him away from being a fisherman and said, "Follow me. I want you to preach my word. I want you to be a disciple." And Peter messed up. So Peter went back to fishing. He went back to what Jesus called him out of. How often do we do that? Whenever we feel like, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. Or even if we don't feel like we're not where we're supposed to be and we just can't realize it, how often do we go back to what Jesus called us out of? And that's exactly what Peter does here. He goes back to what God called him away from. And even Peter's perspective shifted. From eternity, when he was with Jesus, when he was with the disciples, when he was living in community, it was on eternity. But as soon as he gets alone, it shifts back to the here and now. I want to read a little bit in John chapter 21. And it says, "When daybreak came, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not know it was Jesus. 'Friends,' Jesus called to them, 'you don't have any fish, do you?' 'No,' they answered. 'Thanks for pointing it out.' 'Cast the net on the right side of the boat,' he told them, 'and you'll find some.' And they did, and they were unable to haul it in because of the large number of fish." The disciple, the one who Jesus loved. And let me just stop there for a second, because this cracks me up. Okay, it says the one who Jesus loved. Do you know who's writing this? John. Do you want to know who he's talking about? The one who Jesus loved? John. He's talking about himself here. Like, it's this humble brag. He's like, well, the one who Jesus loved, me. So the disciple, the one who Jesus loved, said to Peter, It is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he tied his outer clothing around him, for he had taken it off, and plunged into the sea. And I don't know who else, but Peter goes fishing naked. Since they were not far from the land, about 100 yards away, the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. When they got on the land, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish lying on it, and bread. I think it's really important, again, to realize they said they weren't far from land, and Peter jumps in the water. And I don't know if you've ever swam 100 yards, but that's a long ways, and I'm guessing the boat beat him to shore. Like, I don't know why they included that. So, like, Peter probably dives into the water, and he's just swimming as hard as he can, and, like, John and them are just standing on the boat, like, going by him, like, what are you doing? Like, what? Like, what? But it just shows that, like, how excited he was to see Jesus. He could not wait to pull the fish, and he had to jump in and swim towards him. And if we keep reading, we find out that Jesus asks him, "Do you love me?" And Peter responds, "Yes, I love you." And then Jesus asks him again, "Do you love me?" And he says, "Yes, Lord, like I love you." He says, "Do you love me?" And he says, "Yes." And he says as he was grieved because he asked him a third time. And if you remember, he denied him 3 times. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And then Jesus asks him, "Do you love me?" 3 different times. Peter was with his community of people. He was back with some of the disciples, but yet his perspective was still focused on this life. And his perspective didn't flip, it didn't change until Jesus came back into the picture. Because the only way that your perspective is going to change is when Jesus changes it. We live in a community to remind us. That's why we live in community and we do life with people, is to remind us to look at eternity, but nothing changes our perspective until Jesus does it himself. I want you to imagine for a second how different your life would look if your focus was on eternity. What would you stop doing right now in your life if you were focused where you were supposed to be focused? If you took your eyes off of all the negativity and all the stress and the anxiety that's coming from your life where you are right now, if you took your eyes off of that and looked at eternity, how much different would your life look? Like, think about it. How much different would your life look? And then think about how much different our area would look, our community, like Chilhowie, would look if we had a whole church of people that were focused on eternity rather than focused on their own problems and their own lives. The gospel is about redeeming the world, right? We do it when we're focused on that rather than being focused on our own lives. Think about how much different our community would look if you were focused, if our church was focused on that rather than being focused on our own lives. It looked drastically different. But the only way it's going to happen is when Jesus shifts your focus. Revelation chapter 19, verse 6 through 9. Then I heard something like the voice of a vast multitude, like the sound of cascading waters, and like the rumbling of loud thunder, saying, Hallelujah, because our Lord God the Almighty reigns. Let us be glad and rejoice, and give him glory, because the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has prepared herself. She was given fine linen to wear, bright and pure, for the linen represents the righteous acts of the saints. Then he said to me, Write, blessed are those invited to the marriage feast of the Lamb. He also said to me, These words of God are true. If you're new to church or new to Christianity, that might sound a little confusing and weird. The bride of Christ, all that. Well, let me explain that real quick. The bride is the church. And I mean the capital C church, not the lowercase. The capital C church, meaning people from all over the world who have a relationship with Jesus. People from all different countries, all over the world who have a relationship with Jesus. That's the church. And the church is the bride of Christ. Not us personally, but the community of people. Again, community of people are the bride of Christ. And that there's going to be a wedding day feast, or a wedding feast. And in Jewish customs with weddings, it's kind of similar to how we do things. There's an engagement, then there's a marriage, and then there's a feast, or the reception, right? Well, here we're talking about the wedding feast, which was a celebration of the fact that the church had been reconciled back to Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I'm excited for the fact that it says that we are invited to the wedding feast. We're invited to the celebration. And all it's a matter of doing is us accepting the invitation that has been given to every single one of us in this room. We've been invited to the wedding feast to fix our gaze. We've been invited to fix our gaze on Jesus and to take our eyes off of this life and to focus on eternity. I don't know about you all, but that gets me excited. Like, think about that. We have the opportunity to spend eternity in God's presence. Is that not unbelievable? In closing today, I just want to say, I want you to pray. If you're realizing, hey, my focus isn't where it should be. My focus is not even close to where it should be. I'm focused on my life right now. If that's you, I'm going to ask, again, I told you, Jesus changes your focus, right? Jesus changes your focus, not anyone else. If this morning your focus is in the wrong place, I'm asking you while I'm praying for you to be praying and saying, Jesus, fix my focus on eternity. My focus isn't where it should be. Jesus, fix it. Shift where I'm focused. God, thank you so much this morning. I pray that you would just shift our focus onto the eternity that exists with you instead of focused on the life and the problems that exist here. God, I just pray that we think about your presence and that we have a desire and a want to spend eternity with you. God, I'm so thankful that we've been invited to the wedding feast. That as the bride of Christ, I just pray that we exist in community so that we can remain focused on you, so that we can be in attendance for that celebration. If this morning you haven't accepted Jesus, we want to give you that opportunity. Because just like the people who have already accepted Jesus are invited to that wedding feast, so are you. It's a matter of accepting Jesus. Me and Richard are going to be down here up front. We want you to come and we want to talk with you. We want to help you take the next steps into your community and into a relationship with Jesus. We want you to be part of what we are talking about. It's exciting to be part and to be invited to the wedding feast. Like, can we thank God this morning for being invited to the wedding feast? Like, for real. Like, can we thank God and put our hands together and clap for God for the fact that we've been invited to the wedding feast? If you all will you stand with us as we close out in the song? If you have a decision to make, come and talk with us. If you need prayer, the altars are here for you to come and someone will pray with you. Please come.